Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your made by a small team host, Madelyn.
I'm your made by a small team within $1 million company. $1 billion company, maybe even. Host Emma.
And thanks for tuning in to this week's show. This week, in an unusually topical topic for a Talk This side quest. Well, it's Emma's side quest. I was ready to introduce.
It's not even that topical anymore. It was like last week or something, right?
Usually we wait a solid 3.5 months.
You're right. That is as spicy gets on Talk This podcast.
Did we ever actually do one on Game Awards shows? Because if we did, it was in April.
I think we did. I don't remember when it was, though.
It was long past the Game Awards. I feel confident in that.
But yes, this week, sort of spurred on by the controversy of the Game Awards best indie game nominations for this year, we were talking about what is an indie game? What's that even mean?
I hate to spoil the entire podcast, but in case you only need like a 5-minute listen, I suspect we will not come to a firm conclusion.
No. I don't think so either.
So like and subscribe.
But anyway, if you didn't see, the, Game Award nominees came out, man, I think while we were on vacation, even, maybe. And the best independent games was announced, and among those was a game called Dave the Diver, which I have not played. I don't think we've talked about on the show yet, right? We haven't done that. I think I would have remembered.
Haven't. It got pretty good reviews.
We'll probably talk about it in the show. I've heard it's quite good. I've heard it's very enjoyable. But it is not really what you would call an indie game, really under any stretch of the definition, in my opinion.
Look, let's not rule that out. We've got a lot of sorting through here. Let's just the facts, please.
All right. So the facts is that Dave the Diver was made by a game publishing wing that's meant to be making stuff that's slightly more experimental within the South Korean company Nexon, which is a very large company, millions of dollars company. And what do you know what the team that made Dave the Diver is called? I didn't write it down anywhere, and it's
I'll look it up while you talk.
Escaping me. So they weren't published by Nexon. It is more akin to the Naughty Dog Sony relationship, right? In that it's like a named branch under the company. They're owned by Nexon.
And that name is Mint Rocket.
Mint Rocket is just a team within Nexon that makes more experimental type things. Somebody from Nexon has said recently, it may resemble an indie game, but it's not necessarily indie, was the quote. And Jeff gave a beautifully waffling answer when asked about why it was included in nominations. So there's the facts of the matter.
But it spurred a much broader conversation, and one that seems to echo a conversation that was happening right around the first indie game boom of 2011, is what I discovered in preparing for this podcast, of what does the word indie even mean in the year almost 2024?
Yeah. So technically, right, if you're going off the derived word of independent that indie comes from, theoretically an indie game is a game that's made independently of shareholders or stocks or publishers or other companies. It's just a game that people come together and make and put out there, right? Is the very technical, I guess, definition of what an indie game is. But that's not really how indie game is used in common parlance. I read some articles that were it's not really indie if you're a publisher, but then there are publishers that call themselves indie publishers, right? Devolver Digital is probably the biggest one, Annapurna, any number of other indie publishers, I'm sure, that you can think of. Even like, you know, other like other game companies that make their own games will sometimes publish indie games. So in common parlance, publishing is not really
it's not disqualifying necessarily.
A disqualifier for indie.
To really clarify, to really drill down, to be an independent game, you have to be mentioned in Thomas Jefferson's seminal 1776 treatise on games.
Right, yes. Of course.
You all are familiar with the title. I don't need to do that.
Yes, you can't.
Ultimately, there is one exception to that, which is if you can get Lucasfilms to let you make an adaptation of, say, The Last Crusade. That also can be known as an indie game.
So what Madelin's trying to say is, if you're British, you can't make an indie game.
That's correct. It's not what the founders intended.
I'm glad you snuck a joke in here.
It's a very complicated question because, and we're going to spend this podcast digging into, well, here's one way you can define it, but if you do that, you sweep in all of these things that you might not want to. And here's another way you can define it. But if you do that, you sweep in all of these games that you might not want to, which I think makes it very, very tricky. It's not even really like I can Venn diagram it. It just sort of, and that's why I spoiled at the beginning of probably we'll walk away from this saying, yeah, with a little bit more opinion than that. But it's so tricky to create a set of rules that excludes everything that you would want to exclude and includes everything you would want to include. And that's why I have some sympathy for the Game Awards. Like, it does sort of feel like, oh, well, there should be rules for this category. But then all the time, there are games that feel like they should be in it that follow those rules, and there are games that don't feel like they should be in it that, I think I said that backwards. But, like, your rule, it's hard to create a rule set that feels like it captures how this is used.
Yeah, today. But, like, at the same time, you know, Jeff gave this whole, like, spiel about, like, is it Indian spirit? You know, if something published by Team 17, can that be indie anymore? I don't know. It's like, Jeff, man, it's your award show. You can define it.
Yeah.
That's your job. It's your show.
Sort of. I mean, technically, Jeff is just the face of it, right? It's the outlets.
I know. I'm pushing things on Jeff.
Gamer Jeff.
Yeah, not to get into, like, this isn't a show about the Game Awards, but I didn't realize they had, like, an outlet voting system, so they only get, like, 120 ballots. Because they, like, take the collective of the outlet and then they send that to the Game Awards. Super weird to me.
I do want to talk about this a little because part of what is ostensibly at stake in the definition of an indie game, like, really the only thing that's at stake in the definition of an indie game, that's not 100% true. Like, some of these festivals, maybe, right? But one of the big things is the Game Awards. Like, we can quibble all day about what genre terms and stuff mean, right? But ultimately, those are just things we use to help us understand if we want to get a game or not, or what a game might be. But when you're in award show season, yeah, like, having definitions that mean something means something. And I say award show season as if there's more than one award that is anything in games. The BAFTAs, maybe, but...
No, there's, you know, for indie games, if you win, like, the Independent Game Festival, for example.
That's true.
Like, within that space, there's a lot more awards that if people are really into, like, smaller development scene, will be paying attention to.
That's fair.
The Game Awards, I mean, one issue with the Game Awards, the fact that they have to have a indie category at all, when, as we will discuss, that's so all-encompassing, right? That is, like, I think by the way that people use indie, the majority of games coming out every year, and especially if you include, like, all the stuff that comes out on itch, you know, or other, like, game distribution sites like itch, where people are just like, here's a visual novel I made this weekend. Can just put that up there. The majority of games coming out every year are indie, right?
Yeah.
And so
that's
it's kind of weird to be like, here's a whole slew of the game industry that are all different genres and styles and looks and teams and, you know, budgets and whatever. And we're just gonna, we have like, you know, we've got indie, we've got debut indie, and we've got games for impact, which is basically like a third indie category award.
But see, that's what I'm getting at is because, you wish that this might be different, right? But it's because of what the Game Awards actually are, which is a marketing showcase, right? Which is true of all award shows. Like, I don't mean to 100% single out the Game Awards, but even more so than the Oscars or the Emmys or the Tonys or what have you, the Game Awards are like a big marketing event. And because of the way that like games, like the voting for this has to work and voting for anything has to work, of course the games that are going to, you know, go to the Game of the Year thing, you're just never going to see an upset in those nominations. It's not set up to do that, and it's hard for that to happen in a game space where, like you said, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of indie games. And I was thinking about this as we were doing this. I was like, oh, like I understand the idea of this outlet voting system because otherwise, you know, games are so long, right? It is unique. If you're a Tony voter, you have to see at least almost all of the shows to vote, right? Like there's a requirement of that. It's not a requirement of the Oscars. I have no idea how the Emmys work, but all of these are just individual people, but they have like much more. There's like more rules around it. But like it's possible to do that. It's possible to be a Tony voter and see all of the shows. It's literally not possible, even if you were just committing to playing like all of the AAA games that might be in consideration. Like that's literally not possible. They're too long.
Yeah.
So I'm sympathetic to the outlet system, although it of course just takes the issue of like nothing weird can get through and kind of passes the buck one step lower.
Yeah. And it's also like, people on the Oscar voting, a lot of them work in movies.
Yeah.
Right? Game Awards, it's just the media and influencers. Yeah. And some public vote.
Like the Hollywood Foreign Press Association.
They have like 50 people that vote, don't they?
No, they have expanded their membership greatly after everyone was like, this is old and white and really bad.
Yeah.
So I think it's more than that. But like, yes. Yes, agreed. But all this to say...
I'm just saying, if you had people who consider themselves indie game developers voting for nominations at the Game Awards, you might get more interesting nominees occasionally.
100%. But given that that's never going to happen, these indie categories, despite the fact that they are totally incongruous, become very important. Because there's just no opportunity. There's one slot in the Game of the Year nomination for a breakout quasi-indie game. Yeah. Maybe. Each year.
Which, like, this year is, like, Baldur's Gate 3, which is already, like, borderline.
Which we'll talk about, right? Baldur's Gate 3 gets swept into indie if you're just going to talk about business structure, which obviously does not really feel very right.
Yes.
But, you have to have, though, to do that, a level of breakout success like Baldur's Gate 3, like a Hades, right? Where... like, frankly, a level of breakout success, which then jeopardizes your ability to refer to any other game that you release as indie ever again. I think Supergiant is such an interesting case as a studio that is, like, tiny and obviously an independent studio, but they had this huge breakout hit game, and that feels like it puts them...
Well, you linked to this interview from when they did Bastion, which I didn't realize they did, like... a sort of publishing partnership deal with, like, what was it? It was WB?
I think so.
Which, like, they didn't really take directly money from them. I didn't fully understand what he was trying to say with that, but essentially they just sort of like, yeah, you can help us out, and didn't seem to give them any sort of like influence rights over Bastion at all. So I thought that was actually a really interesting example of like the tension of being a more independent game developer, but also wanting your game to, you know, get in front of people and people to play it.
Yeah.
But so it's like, yeah, like that's independent, but they also had this thing on the side that helped them like boost Bastion up a little bit, to the point that it was getting some sort of attention, rather than just releasing it into the void, as a lot of indie games do have to do if they don't get picked up by, you know, whatever Devolver.
And I want to be clear too that part of the reason I think that this definition is something that is, if not like important to pursue, something Jeff might consider pursuing, is the games that are 120% obviously indie are not the games that are getting nominated for best indie game. There are exceptions to that, of course, but for the most part, the games that get nominated in these categories are the indie breakout games. Like, again, in the same way as you don't see too many of those even indie breakout games make it into Game of the Year, you don't see a like, wow, only one outlet reviewed this game, but they gave it a 10 out of 10 kind of game breaking into best debut indie. It's just not how it works. It rewards the games that got a review on every site and are indie because they broke out. And a lot of the times that means those games have a publisher or, you know, whatever thing you want to point to that might make them slightly poisoned indie status. And so that's why it's, you know, there's stakes to that. I'm sure there's data out there somewhere about how the Game Awards impacts sales, but you would assume that it does. So there's stakes to that, there's financial stakes to that, and the total unwillingness to define it is fine, I guess, but also like has consequences for that.
Yeah. Like I was just checking. I do think technically Dave the Diver doesn't have a publisher, but is made within Nexon. I think the only nominee that is not published by someone is Sea of Stars, and I know Sea of Stars got like the Game Pass and PlayStation Plus deals that probably gave them some money.
Yeah, Game Pass, whole other can of worms.
Yeah, that's all.
Won't even wade in there, but like, yeah, the moment you put your game on Game Pass, are you truly independent anymore from the business sense?
Yeah. I know in the past there's also been some like talk about the best debut indie category. Like I think Neon White was in there once, and it's like, yes, technically the company that made Neon White is new, but the people in it are all veterans, right, of working in games. So is it really a debut indie, you know? And there's that benefit of some indie games too, where it's like, yeah, they're indie, but they're very much like established people in the industry as well. Like Cocoon this year, for example, I think is by the guy that did like Inside. So there's that whole thing too. But
so I think it's clear that unless you wanted to take that category and turn it into something very different than what it is, which is to say like, you have to just throw this game into the void on like only Vampire Survivors can win. Mm-hmm. Even Vampire Survivors, I think, doesn't really. I feel like I remember has some help from somewhere, but like you have to make this game alone in your basement and just put it on itch to qualify, or you're not independent enough. Like it seems clear that doesn't match how we use this. So it feels that we can rule out the idea that to be an indie game, the only qualifier or a necessary and sufficient condition, I'm going to be click with boyfriend here for a moment, is that you do not take any outside financial or any outside thing at all. That just doesn't match how the industry operates at all, and that doesn't match how we use that word.
Yeah.
There's something to it, though. It does feel like you can't be made by Sony.
Yes. Yeah. I said, like, the reason I brought up, like, the Sony Naughty Dog like as a comparison for what Dave the Diver is I saw some comments and some things that's like, if Naughty Dog set aside like 3 people to make like a 2D pixel art shooter, like that wouldn't be an indie game still.
Well, so let's flip it all the way to the other side then, right? So one side of the pendulum, get ready. One side of the pendulum is like business structure. Okay. All the way on the other side to that is like aesthetic, right? Which is in itself a difficult nut to crack. But I think if you're going to be talking about an indie aesthetic, it encompasses things like we talked about in our retro gaming episode, right? It encompasses pixel art. It encompasses people who are aping the PlayStation. It encompasses stuff that isn't photorealistic, basically.
Yeah. Which is why I find stuff like Baldur's Gate 3 to be like interesting examples, because that is going for a photorealistic style. And generally, indies won't go for that because that's expensive. Right? Yep. Or before Ninja Theory got bought by Microsoft, in which case I think that doesn't count anymore. But when they made the first Hellblade, that was an indie sort of effort. But they're all like very experienced at motion capture, right? So they were able to go for a more photorealistic style. But a lot of indies won't go for that just because photorealism is expensive no matter what. Whereas there's a variety of different art styles that can be varying degrees of expensive, right? So there is this like assumption that an indie game is going to have some sort of stylized art, whether like you're saying that's pixel or old school or like toon art, or if it's 3D it'll be like, with shades or whatever, it'll be blocky, Minecraft, right? Or whatever. Yeah. But that's not necessarily the case. Although it does tie back to, like, budgets, right? If you are a more well-off indie studio, like Larian, you can go for that, right? Because you have more money. But then, is there a certain amount of money that a company needs to be below in order for it to be considered indie at the end of the day?
This is another direction on my pendulum, right? Is budget, right? So and in some ways, I do think that this cannot happen, right? But in some ways, I do think that budget would be one of the clearest ways, like the way that would, like, for the most part, probably if you were to select one thing on its own, correctly get most correct. I mean,
in some ways, though, I would be interested. Because, publishers are there partially to give you funding to do things. So, for a very high-profile Annapurna thing versus Larian, is there a lot of difference in the budget there? Or is whoever made 12 Minutes just, getting it from Annapurna versus Larian is able to pull it from themselves?
But see, that's sort of what I'm saying, is maybe this doesn't so much solve the indie definition debate as if I were doing the Game Awards. Like, I'm thinking of the DC, I'm pretty sure that Helen Hayes, which is the DC Theater Awards, the DC Tonys, does do, like, a 2 budget size category, right? And, well, that doesn't necessarily, I'm sure that doesn't, in fact, do a perfect cross-cut of, like, who are the really well-established theaters and who are the new theaters. I'm sure that there is some crossover there. I could certainly see from a leveling the playing field perspective of saying, this is our Secret Santa gift limit for your game, right? $1 limit. Would do a better job of setting games of similar scope, ambition, support against each other. Now, does that capture what an indie game is? No. And does Jeff want to publicly bandy about what certain games cost? No. So,
well, it's not even Jeff. No game company is interested in doing that, really.
So, I'm talking as Jeff as the figurehead of the industry.
Right. Jeff, the leader of the secret games underground.
Jeff, chief marketing officer of games.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So that wouldn't serve anyone, but if you were going to make, like, the fairest possible award category, that might come pretty close. It's bad, though.
Yeah.
But it could do that. And then, of course, there's the team size thing. But and again, like, in some ways that comes pretty close, but it doesn't do anything to account for the fact that a team of 10 means something very different if it's just you and your buddies than if you're working with Devolver.
Yeah.
Than if you're working with Sony. So it's tricky. And I think part of what makes it even trickier is that the music industry has already set a precedent of a meaningless indie word.
Yeah. When I was in high school, I loved just throwing indie onto genres because I didn't know what genres meant in music, to be honest. So everything was like, oh, yeah, I guess they're like indie rock.
Yeah.
What does that mean? High school Emma? I don't know.
It just means that they're not the Beatles.
They're not the Beatles.
Yeah, no, I mean, a bunch of articles about this talk about this. Of much like with games, indie music or alternative music did start as a designation of you weren't with a major label. But of course now in 2024 especially, I mean this happened way before this, but especially now in 2024 I say, I'm in next month already. But like a major label, who cares?
Yeah.
I mean, cares. But it's a totally different world than when, indie tag was first emerging and talking about whether or not someone is on a major label, like, is not indicative of anything. And it for a while, it maybe referred to a certain sound. And yeah, now I feel like, much as with games, it just sort of means, like, Nintendo didn't release it. Taylor Swift didn't release it.
Yeah.
So it's indie.
Yeah. And yeah, you talked about like the indie game explosion of like 2010, 2011. I read, just a little article of like everybody always points to like Braid as like the first like a big indie hit. So there's an interesting article with a few indie developers like the guy who made Inside and Supergiant and one other that was just talking about like when Braid came out. And a lot of them were like, well, there's a lot of games that came out around that time that were indie and broke out into success. Like Castle Crashers, for example, actually outsold Braid when it came out. World of Goo. We had World of Goo. Do you remember World of Goo?
I forgot about World of Goo for a long time.
And it's just more like around that time, there was introductions to more mainstream distribution platforms, like Xbox Live, for example, where you could put your game and people wouldn't have to go to Newgrounds to find it, for example.
Yeah.
So that's something, too. Like, one thing I think about is if a game has a physical release, although this is becoming less relevant.
Yeah.
But if a game has a physical release on launch, through just normally, not like through Limited Run or Fangamer or whatever, it's probably not an indie game, right? Because indies have relied on the digital platforming to get out there.
I think it works that way. And I think maybe 5 years ago, it works pretty well in reverse, too, of if it's only on digital, it's probably an indie game. But that's gone.
Yep.
That direction does not flow.
That's
anymore.
A whole other topic now. I mean, I'm playing Alan Wake 2, and I still have to buy, like, a Dragon Gaiden. Both very clearly not indie games. Although perhaps Remedy could fit under a very broad definition, but probably not.
If you were going to sweep Larian in, you might be able to bring Remedy along.
Remedy is public, though, which I think it's traded.
Okay.
As a company, which I think puts it a little bit differently than Larian, but still, whatever. But I'm gonna play those two games that don't have physical releases, at least not in the West, in the case of Gaiden, that are very much not indie games. They just don't have a physical release. And you can look at like stuff like Limited Run, which was like, they would release indie games on disc that will do things like we've got Persona 3 and Persona 4, the ports, because they didn't do physical releases of those. So even that is like bigger companies that aren't indies are also using those to make physical releases of their games.
So it's just really, really slippery, because the moment you can point to something that's a marker, that's something we can use, the industry changes, and that's not something you can use anymore. Like, again, 5-ish years ago, you might have been able to point to, pixel art. Pixel art, that's definitely an indie game. But now we have our pixel art revolution, our 2D, 3D, whatever revolution, and pixel art no longer an indication of something being made by an independent team.
Yeah, and like, just going back to budgets, like something like Octopath Traveler's budget is not that much smaller. Like, it's not smaller because it's pixel art, right?
Right.
That graphical style is expensive, actually. But you still might look at it and assume it's cheaper.
Yeah.
Right. Which is interesting.
So, and there's just so many things. There's so many games that you're like, that's an indie game, and you're like, no, it had major publishing support.
Yeah.
Right? All, like, so many of these early ones, necessarily, right? Like, how are you getting onto Xbox Live? Somebody's got to help you onto Xbox Live. It's not like now.
Yeah.
Just like anybody. It's not Steam.
Steam used to have a green light program.
Yeah.
Not anymore.
So one, and I don't even know, like, I was reading this article, and I don't even know if this article actually said this, or if I just thought it while I was reading it. But one, interesting, like, unquantifiable, useless for Jeff metric, then I think it might be an interesting avenue to explore for our proposed definition here, is creative freedom. Which might allow us to help a little bit with sorting out some of our publisher, not publisher type games. And might even allow flexibility for the rare, truly autonomous Dave the Diver type game to sneak in. Which is the team involved, like, themselves, let's say, in charge, with not having to account to anyone for 95% of their decisions, right? And certain publishing, like, that feels like, it sweeps in most of the Devolver games, right? The big Devolver thing is they, like, want you to do your thing, right? Is what I've heard the developers say about them. But it might not allow us to do something where the publisher is sort of more heavily, all of our horrible stories from the past few months of the publisher being like, I want this, I want that, I want this, I want that.
Unfortunately, something like that is very hard to quantify.
Absolutely. It's impossible. It's useless. But in the philosophical spirit.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's sure the vibe, right? That's the vibes that Jeff is talking about when he's like... I know.
I've come back around to a sympathy for Jeff's definition. I'm like, not bad. Part of an indie.
Which... I mean, there is something there, the idea of you being able to realize your vision. I mean, in a lot of ways, the indie term was made less as its own thing and more in opposition to the AAA definition.
Right.
Saying it's not, like one of those games that has thousands of people working on it and committees and whatever going on and all this stuff. It's like it's just the people made it, right? And then they put it out in the world and you enjoyed it. You loved the twist at the end of Braid. You eat it up. But I still don't think that can be, it. Because I think that, I read a lot that's like, in a lot of ways, indie is just like a sort of marketing thing, I read something from some indie platform that shows things, like awards or show or whatever. And they're saying, like, we picked indie because the types of people we wanted here were calling themselves indie. So we just sort of went with that. Where was I going with this?
Well, it comes down a little bit to, like, okay, well, like, why... Okay, so Game Awards, fine.
But if, okay, so, like, for Dave the Diver, like, the company Nexon made that thing, made the little company, so that they could make more experimental stuff for them, right? That's still a big company, like, being like, oh, these indie games, the people like them. They think, how cool. We're so sick of all these PC games coming out super buggy on release, right? We're so sick of photorealism. We want smaller, shorter games now. Let's just... I don't know how the people at Dave the Diver were paid. Let's ignore that part of the Sonic quote. And we want them now, and I'm not kidding. And they're like, oh, business opportunity, right? So even if the people making Dave the Diver had independent freedom and could make the game that they want, it's hard to think of them as indie when they were created by a big company to tap into that market for them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it also, I mean, maybe this is just me, but I think the indie game label, it makes me feel cool.
Sure, right? Yeah.
A little bit, like, I discovered something.
Yeah.
Which is such a throwback to, like, why I liked indie rock in the, like, that time period, too, of, like, I found it first.
Yeah. Kind
of thing. And you don't get that with Mario.
Yeah.
You'll never get to be like, I found Mario.
I found Mario. Have you heard of this game? Super Mario Wonder.
Like, it gives you that little, like, tastemaker thing.
Yeah.
Which, for some people is not why they play games, right? But if you're, like, a recovering hipster, like any of us, like, that might be it.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
I feel that way, There's games that are not indie that I feel that way about, too. Just because the circles that I run in. But it's more of a joy when you discover that someone else has played whatever. Not this like Stardew Valley almost doesn't count as indie anymore because of how huge it is, but it is. Although they had a publisher, obviously. But it's like, it's so much more of a joy when you discover that someone else has played Stardew Valley than like, oh, you also played like
Spider-Man 2.
Tears of the Kingdom this year.
Yeah. But I mean in that way, like, not the indie label isn't just marketing that big companies can take advantage of to a certain extent. It's also like when there are so many indies, to call yourself that and then be able to submit your game to all of these like specialized things that have cropped up to give indie games marketing, right? Of like showcases, especially now with Summer Game Fest. All these showcases that are for indies, all these awards that are for indies. And you just sort of have to do that because you don't... Maybe it's to the marketing budget, Mm-hmm. Do you have to rely on outside sources for your marketing budget? Then you're really indie.
Yeah. That gets us to our reveal your budget problem again, though. Emma.
Yeah, just part of it, though.
Yeah.
I don't need to know all of it. I just need to know how much you had free for, like, ads. That gets into the other controversy also of, like, should people be paid to play your game?
We're not going there.
Should influencers get paid to play your game or review your game?
There should be more money for everyone in the industry.
You're right.
Done.
Everybody should have money.
There should just be more money.
There should just be more money.
Yeah, ultimately it was interesting to watch so much of this conversation about indie games feel quite philosophical. When in the end, the real definition of an indie game is like, it's not released by these 10 companies or their subsidiaries.
Yeah.
These days, more or less. which is kind of crazy. But it has like I think you're right to be like it's a marketing thing, which is so weird because it doesn't mean anything. Like
Yep.
it's maybe it was an effective. All of this stuff just feels like, oh, it lives 5 years ago, it lives 10 years ago, and now calling something indie, it has so little meaning that how much marketing value could it have? Except the access it gets you.
Yeah.
Which is so funny. The access it gets you. The whole point is that you don't have any access. That's why you're independent.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are indies that, aren't published. Slay the Princess. Very successful. That's not published by anything. So there are games out there that even without, the backing of Devolver or Annapurna or Thunderful or whatever, or Sony or whatever, can get out there and get noticed. But it's just interesting when, there probably did used to be like very much like two separate levels. But it's very much not that case now. We have like 5 levels.
Well, I think it's notable that both in this podcast and I really feel like just in general conversation, AA is not a thing at all.
Some people like it,
Sure.
I've seen like Remedies stuff sometimes referred to as AA, but it's not that useful of a term either, to be honest.
Like, what does it even mean?
Yeah, it just means, like, it looks like it has a high budget, but it's not, a company owned by Sony or Microsoft.
Like, is Larian
sort of what
AA?
I think
Is Supergiant AA? AA just feels like this was good.
AA is just sort of like, it seems like
quite as good as
they put some money into it.
Oh, it's much better than I expected, but it's not Nintendo. Or it's like a company that's like almost that big, but it's like a B movie.
Yeah, something was also like, sometimes people instead of AA will be like, oh, a B game. I read at least a couple that's like, why are we grading them?
Yeah.
No,
it's not
a B
game.
movie
It's a B
and a
game.
B
Like,
game.
I don't think of a B movie as being like it was rated a B. I think of a B movie as having transcended the academic grade system and it's its own category.
Yeah, it's not. I don't think I meant that, like, literally. I know what a B movie is, Madelyn.
I know.
But I think that, like, what you would call a AA or a B game is not the same as what you would call a B movie, right?
Yeah.
It's the
Honestly,
AAA games
Dave the
that
Diver
have
a B game
funny
feels
bugs.
like... What?
It's the AAA games that have funny bugs, right?
Yeah. You're right. You're so right that everything that makes a B movie is actually much more of a AAA thing.
Yeah.
No, if there was a real thriving use of the word AA, that's the perfect place to put Dave the Diver, right? This like association.
Is it?
I don't know. Why not? It's from it's from a big company, but it's not a big game.
It is a big game. It was very successful.
It's from a big company,
long.
But it's not.
It has multiple different game modes in it.
Sorry, it's from a big company, but its budget isn't AAA.
I guess. Is it? Do you know that?
I don't know that, but I have to assume that there's no way that game cost as much as Call of Duty.
I don't know. I watched a lot of it. I was like, this seems expensive.
Okay,
so,
maybe I'm not using
that.
a great example here, but that could be a place where all of these, like, oh, it's stylistically indie, but it's from a giant company, like a ostensive category for those.
But then we're just like, it's
know.
the stylistically indie that, like, really irks me. Because, like, what the frick does that mean?
Okay,
like,
maybe
at that point, we're just perverting the word indie entirely, you know?
I'll
get rid of
define it a little differently
pixels,
then.
it's just indie.
You keep interrupting me. I'll define it a little differently.
I wasn't done yet. You're interrupting me.
For the the hypothetical example everyone's throwing around of like, what if it's the 10-person team within Sony who made something weird? But I think double A is, I don't even really know why I'm pushing this. I think double A is a useless term and nobody uses it. I think we've established the fact that we're just using indie for everything that's not Mario or Final Fantasy or whatever. Is Final Fantasy an indie game? Nobody owns Square yet.
God willing.
I'm just saying.
They're a publicly traded company, though.
I guess. Yeah. But once you get it like that, too, it's like, okay, if I do a Kickstarter, am I no longer indie?
That's not the same as being publicly traded.
I know it's not. But it's
Kickstarters are not, in fact, shareholders at all.
You're beholden to investors.
Yeah. You're not beholden to your Kickstarter people, though.
You're supposed to be.
You have to hit that box on the Kickstarter that says, I understand that sometimes things fall apart before you pledge anything. So, there's that. Sure, you lose some public trust, but you don't really have to do anything for your Kickstarters that you fail, I don't think.
Maybe the definition of indie is just you're indie until Tencent buys a stake.
Now that one, that's good, I think.
I think it's pretty good.
That's it. That's the one.
I have one final piece of advice for the Game Awards, if you feel like that's the definition.
What's the definition? Oh, just that there's no Tencent?
Tencent doesn't own. And, like, I'll throw, like, Sony Nintendo, right? Sony, like, they don't own a stake in you. You're indie.
Okay. That's way too broad of a definition, but okay.
It's the only definition. There's nothing else to do.
I think it's just, as a game community, we have a lot of terms that just simply don't mean anything. All of our genre labels, AAA, indie, anything else you want to throw in there. We have a lot of words that we throw around that actually mean nothing. And I think that perhaps indie is one of them. In that it just doesn't mean anything, really. You can assume, yes, it's not from Sony or Nintendo or Microsoft.
Yeah.
That's about all you can get from the common parlance of the word indie. But I think that, and this will lead into your advice for the Game Awards.
Yes.
I think that if you're going to run an award show, you should have a detailed definition of your categories. And this is like in general, because their genre categories get messed up sometimes too. I just feel like they don't send a definition to the outlets that are voting sometimes, or a bad one. They send bad definitions. And I think that if you're going to run an award show, and I know it's just a marketing stunt, Jeff, but if you want it to be taken seriously at all, make up your mind. Make a decision. What's an indie game to you? What's an action-adventure game, Jeff? Tell us. Please tell us.
I think part of the issue, I think something that would have to go along with that for the Game Awards is, like every other award show, and I'm sorry to create like an administrative burden for developers, I'm sorry, the games have to submit. And that you might give them an opportunity in that submission to self-genre identify.
Yeah, I think what is currently is...
There's no submission process currently. That is the process.
They can send codes to the outlets that vote.
They're allowed to.
Yes.
But there's no, like, to be considered for the Oscars, to be considered for the Grammys, you have to submit.
Yeah.
And there's no, it's just like, is this a game? Someone, like, anyone can decide that they're going to vote for it.
Yeah.
But here's my advice for the Game Awards. Because, yeah, as Emma said, the issue here is not just with the indie category. If you look at any category at the Game Awards, there's no definition of what it means. And frequently there are games in there that the game's social media sphere is like, that doesn't make sense to be in this category. So I really think the Game Awards would be better if they just scrapped most of this. We can keep Game of the Year, we can keep best... Like, some of their awards are fine. The stuff that is much more, like, Oscars-y, fine. Keep Game of the Year. Keep best performance. Keep art direction. Like, many of that stuff is meaningless in the Oscars, too. So, then people don't, like, vote for things that aren't real there, too. Fine. But I really think that you should fill out the rest of the awards show with bolder, weirder, perhaps more water cooler moment generating awards. Things like best game that could have been released on the PlayStation 1, best fishing minigame, best in-game pet, right? Get wild with it. Because in those places, we both solve the definition is pretty clear issue, and we create opportunities where an indie game could actually triumph in these categories. A true indie game, or at least a borderline AA true indie game with a publisher. And you create those moments where the David can fell the Goliath, which does not really happen as it stands now, and I think that would be more exciting. And think of the marketing campaigns.
I don't know if I agree with your category specifically, but I do think that the Game Awards would benefit from awards that are more game specific. Yeah.
I went pretty whimsical with it, but
Yeah.
I think that there's space for some of those whimsical categories because I think that they are fun. But I also think, yeah, just like getting more specific of, yeah, sure, do best HUD.
I mean, just generally the, like, genre labels, you know, it's like this in, like, the Golden Globes, too. It's like, what's a comedy anymore?
Yeah, comedy musical.
But just, and clearly with Dave the Diver's nomination, indie is being used as a genre label as well, right?
Yeah.
They're using it as, like, a vibe, not, like, any sort of technical definition. But I think that just having a bunch of genre awards isn't actually that interesting. And a lot of times don't encompass fully what a game is. Like this year, Final Fantasy 16's in the RPG category, right? Which, like, sure, it's technically an RPG, right? But it's also action or action adventure, if you want to put it in both of those. And so just sticking it in RPG feels like it's sort of doing that game a disservice to what it actually encompasses. Yep. And so, you know, you get things that aren't actually that interesting. And you get things that don't really belong in those categories. So why do we have these categories to begin with?
That's why we should have things like best sword.
And that's why I think a lot of cases you don't, you know, a lot of indie games, what make them interesting, perhaps, and not to say AAA doesn't do this too, but they might be genre mashes. We do this on every full episode, right?
Yes, good plug.
And perhaps the reason why they don't get nominated in genre categories that often is because they don't fit neatly into them sometimes, you know? And perhaps if we didn't have genre categories, we would see more indies, whatever that means, nominated in other spaces.
So what Emma is really proposing is a category that's best game that could have been a Talk This mashup if we were a little better at that.
Yes, exactly.
So think about it, Jeff. We have a contact form on the website.
Indeed. Yes.
On that note, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
If you enjoyed the show, wow, I just completely forgot it. That was incredible. This has never happened to me. I just go into a fugue state normally when I do this. But I was like, what's the first thing I do? I almost went straight to subscribe. No, if you enjoy the show, the thing that you should actually do is follow us on social media. I mean, actually, you should subscribe. But the first thing you should do is follow us on social media, especially if you have any thoughts to share about the show. You could put them in the contact form. Emma might check it.
I don't really know how.
I'll look at it this week. Send us some comments on what you think an indie game is. But we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog featuring long-running series Click Click Boyfriend and Split Screen. But most importantly, so importantly that I almost skipped the other two parts, you should subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, wherever you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Talk This. Clickbait Boyfriend was only in our top 17% of listeners in his Spotify Wrapped.
Wow.
I was like, who's listening more than Clickbait Boyfriend?
Somebody
Show up. Show yourself. If you are the 1% Talk This Podcast listener, please let us know. Tag us. I want to know. I want to know who's listening more than Clickbait Boyfriend. Other than, like, Dad, probably. Maybe. If he even listens. I don't know where anyone listens. It's mysterious. Whatever. I hate Spotify Wrapped. That's my real hot take. But next week, I have no idea what we're talking about. It's December, and my brain is frozen.
Next week, we are talking about Advance Wars and Lords of the Fallen.
Right. And I was like, Lord of the Flies. And you were like, no.
Yes, I wasn't having it.
Now. So look forward to that. The week after that, it's Somehow 6 Weeks in Gaming, which I have is just the title of the show. Somehow 6 Weeks in Gaming. Because that's how I introduce it every time. And then we get into winter holiday season. So I think we get one more main edition. And then we get a New Year's Eve gaming year in review.
Festive. Yeah, on the 31st, it'll still come out noon on Sunday. But perhaps you could wait and listen to it at midnight instead.
We'll do like one of those, like, if you start listening to Talk This at exactly this time.
I feel like we've done that before.
We have. At midnight, you'll start your year with Madelyn saying, "This is the best Yakuza game yet," or something like that. I think that's beautiful.
Look forward to it.
Look forward to it. Anyway, that's it for this week's show. Thanks for listening. Emma, you have a good indie sign-off?
This week, I hope that your independent spirit gives vibes to the people around you to nominate you for awards you aren't eligible for.
Indeed.